Okay.
Got it. All right, are people coming in? Ah, here they come. Welcome, everybody. Come right on in. Find a seat. And I'm checking. Make sure, if you would, that you are that you're automatically muted as you enter. That'll help with our audio. And I'm seeing people as being in. So let us begin. Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the first Friday lecture for the month of January. Today's speaker is Christopher Lynch, and his title is Machiavelli's Meanings. Please note that this presentation is also being recorded, and it will be available on the Graham School Student Community website on Canvas early next week if you want to watch it later. Also, please be aware that you will not be able to unmute your microphones during this presentation as a courtesy to our speaker. You will be able to ask questions in the chat box. You can do so at any time during the presentation. Questions that you type in the chat box, I will keep track of, and then I will pose them to Chris at the end of the lecture during our question and answer period. During the presentation itself, as I say, all will be muted except for our speaker. Chris and I will be able to see your video, but we won't be able to hear you. So if you choose to leave your video on or to turn it off, it is entirely at your discretion. Chris's video will be spotlighted for the most part during the presentation. Consequently, the best way to view the lecture is to select speaker view in Zoom rather than gallery view. Today's lecture is being sponsored by the basic program of liberal education for adults at the University of Chicago's Graham School. My name is Kendall Sharp, and I am the Cyril O'Hoole Chair of the basic program. Before I properly introduce our speaker, I'd like to say a few words about the basic program, the Graham School, and our upcoming courses and events. The basic program is a 4-year certificate program at the University of Chicago's Graham School of Continuing Studies. Since 1946, we have offered our students a rigorous liberal arts curriculum based on the principle that there is no substitute for direct engagement with big ideas in their original texts. Though through focused discussion, our classes provide direct encounters with some of the great works of classical and Western culture in a dedicated community of adult learners led by experienced University of Chicago educated instructors. Due to the current crisis, all of our classes take place remotely. There is still just enough time to register for winter quarter courses, which start only next week. I must say, there is a course on Homer's Iliad that looks really interesting. Online registration has now closed, but you may still register by phone. The Graham School of Continuing Studies traces its origins to the founding of the university. Presently, Graham houses and nurtures programs other than the basic program. Our flagship for credit program is the Master of Liberal Arts. For more non-credit offerings, there is the open enrollment program. And we also have programs that run on an annual basis, such as Know Your Chicago and our great travel program, A Fortnight in Oxford. Speaking of the Oxford trip, we have a few events coming up. On January 19, there will be an information session on travel study in Oxford, led by my colleague, Jan Watson. Also on the 19th, an installment of our series on interdisciplinary inquiry, this one with Professor Harold Pollack of the School of Social Work. Professor Pollack will speak on how to improve the first response for people in mental health crisis in a talk entitled Preventing the Next 911 Call. Then, on February 1, we have the next installment of our Conversations at Graham series, this one with author Alex Sanchez. Alex will discuss memory in writing and also preview his upcoming courses in our writer's studio. Finally, next month, the first Friday lecture will happen on February 1, and the speaker will be basic program instructor Katya Mitova. Katya's title will be The Death and Rebirth of Virgil. You can find more information and register for future First Friday lectures and all other events on our website. As I mentioned before, this presentation is being recorded. The recording will be available to current and former students on the Graham School Community website early next week. Now, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Christopher Lynch received his BA from St. John's College and his PhD from the University of Chicago in the Committee on Social Thought. He is Professor Emeritus of Political Science at Carthage College and has been a visiting associate professor at the University of Chicago. He is the translator of Machiavelli's Art of War and co-editor of Principle and Prudence in Western Political Thought. He has just completed a book on war in all of Machiavelli's writings and is currently at work on a book on Melville's Israel Potter and a translation with Nathan Tarkov of all of Machiavelli's stories and poems. Now, it is my pleasure to turn things over to Chris.
Thanks very much, Kendall. Let me share my screen. I think we're set with that. Okay, Machiavelli's meanings. Machiavelli's significance can be appreciated by grasping the meaning of Machiavelli in three senses of meaning. The substantive meaning of the content of his teachings, what he meant to bring about, or the intended result of his teachings, and finally, the meaning of Machiavelli, the name, the significance of the word Machiavelli. It will also help to consider how this third meaning relates to the first two, that is, how Machiavelli's reputation relates to the intended effects and the substance of his teaching. In the first part of this talk, I'll discuss the substance of his teachings. Then the next two parts will be on the intended effects. The fourth will look into the meaning of his name. And finally, we'll consider how Machiavelli as reader can guide us as both readers of and respondents to him. I'm going to be throwing a lot of quotations at you. This is in good basic program fashion. It is important that you have the text there and you don't take my word for it. On the other hand, don't worry about, there'll be a lot of verbiage. You don't have to read everything. You can listen to what I'm saying and refer to the text as you wish. Kendall should be sending in a document through chat all of the quotations numbered in order, so you can refer to them or look at the PowerPoint as we proceed. So part one, Machiavelli's bold counsel. Machiavelli is best known for boldly breaking from all previous writers in a ringing passage from The Prince, entitled, "Of those things for which men, and especially princes, are praised and blamed." In this case, I'm going to read this whole passage because it's the most important one. Maybe I will, maybe I won't, because I'm being blocked. There we go. "Many have imagined republics and principalities that have never been seen or known to exist in truth. For it is so far from how one lives to how one should live, that he who lets go of what is done for what should be done learns his ruin rather than his preservation. For a man who wants to make a profession of good in all regards must come to ruin among so many who are not good. Hence it is necessary for a prince, if he wants to maintain himself, to learn to be able to be not good, and to use this and not use it according to necessity. It is necessary for him to be so prudent as to know how to avoid the infamy of those vices that would take his state from him, and to be on guard against those that do not, if that is possible. But if one cannot, one can let oneself go with less hesitation. And furthermore, one should not care about incurring the fame or infamy of those vices without which it is difficult to save one's state." Here Machiavelli rejects the ruinous imaginary truths and moral oughts of the tradition and announces his intent to provide the useful effectual truth and the a or immoral is of political life. And he explains right in the midst of that passage why, reading again, For a man who wants to make a profession of good in all regards must come to ruin among so many who are not good. Hence it is necessary for a prince, if he wants to maintain himself, to learn to be able not to be good, and to use this and not use it according to necessity. Machiavelli asserts that his teaching is entirely new, and in particular, we're going to focus on the ideas that one must be prepared to deviate from moral rules, and especially that one must learn to be able to be not good, to learn to be able to be immoral as necessity demands. I'm going to go through some progressively more adequate understandings of this passage. It's often taken to mean that one should act morally whenever one can, even though one must sometimes and with regret deviate from moral precepts. The sense of regret in the occasional deviations is essential to this interpretation, even though when people give the interpretation, it's often left unstated. But it's crucial to recognize that there are no moral grounds provided in the passage or elsewhere in Machiavelli for the idea that such deviations are to be regretted. In fact, the passage counsels concern with moral obligation only as an instrument to gain praise and to secure preservation. What's more, Machiavelli enters, albeit lightly, into the Machiavellian's psychology by noting his decreased hesitation to engage in vice traditionally understood, and by exhorting him not to care about being known as vicious. To say nothing of Machiavelli's assaults elsewhere, especially in his discourses on Livy, on the conscience itself. One's reminded of Boccaccio's saying regarding matters of love. Boccaccio says, better to do and repent than to stay still and repent. One can't help asking under such circumstances, though, why repent at all? An honest reader could concede that there is no strong sense of moral obligation or moral regret, but still maintain that one must nonetheless avoid these deviations if only because they can bring infamy that often does in fact threaten one's state. Machiavelli would respond, I think, that avoidance of the reputation for vice at least as often threatens one's state. For, quoting again, a man who wants to make a profession of good in all regards must come to ruin among so many who are not good. It's his wanting to make the profession. What we could call the competitive character of political life and of human life in general tilts the scales of prudence in the direction of traditional vice rather than traditional virtue. To be better safe than sorry means to strike before being struck. And if one is still concerned with maintaining a reputation for good, if not actually being good, it is important to consider, as we'll have occasion to do in a bit, that a reputation for vice is sometimes not only acceptable, but indispensable. The requisite quality is therefore the ability to be and to appear to be either virtuous or vicious. The question then becomes, when should one be virtuous in the usual sense? And when should one be vicious in the usual sense? And when should one seem to be each? Indeed, this takes us to a still more adequate level of understanding of the passage, since it compels the question of the standard by which one judges one's actions. That standard for Machiavelli is clearly necessity. The necessity in question is what one must do to acquire and maintain status, stato, state. From this perspective of necessity, moral deviation and non-deviation come into view in their purely instrumental form. Each is simply a tool used to do what one must do. And recalling the intensely competitive nature of the political environment, each tool reveals itself to be a weapon. Necessity reigns supreme over any moral considerations. But how does one know what is necessary? The answer to this question brings us to the most adequate level of understanding of the passage. The answer is education. The two most important words in this passage are not praise and blame, good and not good, virtue, vice, ruin, preservation, ought, is, imagination, effectual. The two most important words are learn and know. One must learn two things: to be able to be not good and to use that ability or not according to necessity. To use a scholastic distinction, the former, okay, being able to be not good, is an education of the will. And the latter, using that ability according to necessity, is one of the intellect. The latter could seem merely technical since it's a know how to. But what would one have to know in order really to know what was necessary? What cannot not be in general and in any particular situation? For that matter, what kind of training of the will would be required in order really to be able to do either good or evil according to the intellect's direction? Or could it be that the training of the will is the prerequisite for the training of the intellect, which, once it knows that it knows what's true, directs the will without any effort? Could it be that for Machiavelli, just as for Plato's Socrates, knowledge is virtue, virtue in the Machiavellian sense? Perhaps these questions are too general for our present purposes, so I'll instead consider an example of the kind of willing and knowing under consideration. The example is from The Prince, and it's about Hannibal. Hannibal keeps together a very diverse army, keeps everyone in line under tremendous difficulties. Reading the quote, "This could not have arisen from anything other than his inhuman cruelty, which together with his infinite virtues, always made him venerable and terrible in the sight of his soldiers. And without it, that is without the inhuman cruelty, his other virtues would not have sufficed to bring about this effect. And the writers, having considered this inadequately, on the one hand admire his action, but on the other condemn the principal cause of it." So how very much this passage is about education in the ability to be immoral as necessity demands is made clear in the immediate sequel and its properly identified prequel. For right after this passage, Machiavelli tells us that by being too humane with his soldiers, Scipio Africanus lost control of them. And in the prequel, just a few chapters before, we were explicitly put on alert to see just how much Scipio learned about being humane or merciful from reading a book called The Education of Cyrus. How much his intellect and will were formed by that book. To further underline that this education in the ability to be immoral and to use this ability according to necessity is virtually all in all for Machiavelli, we need to remember that Scipio ultimately beat Hannibal. In this important case, Machiavelli prefers the amoral and intelligent loser to the winner, who's praised for his morality and cares about that. Contrary to common opinion, Machiavelli's deepest concern is less with results than with causes. He's interested in de facto success and failure narrowly understood much less than he is interested in educating rulers to be able to be inhumanly cruel and in other virtues, in contrast to previous writers who admire the effects, success, but deplore the cause, the ability to be immoral and the knowledge of its use. The first challenge Machiavelli places before us then is overcoming moral hesitations and qualms. Many other examples suggest the same thing. If you read through many examples in Machiavelli, you'll see, for instance, that he exposes the moral qualms of an otherwise cold-blooded assassin who nonetheless quakes at the prospect of murdering someone because that someone's in church. Or of the otherwise ruthless Cesare Borgia, who fails because he counted on the power of forgiveness. Or of an unusually bold invader who might have unified Italy if he had just dared to break a promise to the Pope. It turns out, as Machiavelli says in the Discourses on Living, that it is very difficult to be altogether good or altogether evil. Much of the great and deliberately corrupting pleasure of reading Machiavelli consists in being induced to think through the complicated ways one must imitate and improve on the moral flexibility of the Hannibals and Cesares, who so colorfully and ambiguously adorn his works. Part 2, Machiavelli as founder. As if it were not already pretty chilling to tell people to learn to be immoral and use the ability as needed, it turns out that Machiavelli must be up to something vastly more ambitious. Machiavelli claims his teaching is new, that previous writers, all previous writers on politics, have put forward one or another version of Plato's teaching that we should take our bearings by how things ought to be, by the imagined city of the Republic or Augustine's city of God, rather than by the city of man, that our thoughts, words, and deeds must be determined by the good rather than by the necessary. Machiavelli presents himself as a new Columbus, a discoverer of new modes and orders, a discoverer of a whole new world, or the founder of new modes and orders. In this passage at the beginning of the Discourses on Livy, his other comprehensive book, if apparently more traditional book, he talks about the dangers that he faced in finding new modes and orders, and says that he's decided to take a path untrodden by anyone. Machiavelli here announces that he himself is among, and even a level above, perhaps, the greatest example, as he calls them in The Prince, the founders of new modes and orders. These are the great political or civilizational founders: Theseus of Greece, Cyrus of Persia, Romulus of Rome, and Moses of the Hebrews. The Prince uses another metaphor signifying the explorer, albeit a less intrepid explorer. For since men almost always take paths beaten by others and proceed in their actions by imitation, unable either to stay on the path of others altogether or to attain the virtue of those whom you imitate, a prudent man should always take the paths beaten by great men. By advising the ambitious to take the path of those who don't take others' paths, Machiavelli is at once giving them worthy models, but also providing the occasion for the intellectually nimble to begin to distinguish themselves from the merely ambitious. The merely ambitious will eagerly seek to imitate the greats. The intellectually nimble will get Machiavelli's joke. Those who beat the paths were trailblazers with no one else to follow. To follow in their paths is to do the opposite of what they did. Truly to imitate them is to imitate no one. It turns out that one's own prudence is the only guide in the highest cases. Later in the same passage of The Prince, Machiavelli, let me see, later in the same chapter of The Prince, the overlap between his discussion of the greatest examples and his discussion of himself in that earlier Discourses passage becomes more pronounced and even more interesting. When he's talking about these other founders of new modes and orders, he talks about their difficulties. The difficulties they have in acquiring their principalities arise in part from the new orders and modes that they are forced to introduce. Same phrase Machiavelli used of himself. And it creates a complex situation where you have all those who benefited from the old orders as your enemies and your lukewarm defenders, or your defenders are lukewarm. When you introduce a new way of life, you have as enemies those who adhered to the old orders, and those who might defend you will be lukewarm at best, since they have not yet suffered for not following your new way of life. Most importantly for our purposes are the clear echoes of his words about himself in the Discourses: difficulties, dangers, new modes and orders. These echoes leave little doubt that he's talking about the same thing, himself and these men as founders of altogether new ways of life. What then are the old modes and orders Machiavelli must overthrow? Who are potential lukewarm defenders of his new modes and orders? The plot thickens a bit more when we recognize that buried in the praise arising from the virtue required for accomplishing this most difficult and dangerous task is counsel that is still more Machiavellian. If accepted, this counsel would put its recipient into another league entirely. You should introduce new modes and orders without putting yourself at the head. get others to do the more dangerous work, or at least much of the dangerous work. Consider the continuation of the passage from the preface to the first book of the Discourses. We looked at this earlier. If poor talent, this is Machiavelli talking about himself in the preface, if poor talent, little experience of present things, and weak knowledge of ancient things make this attempt of mine defective and not of much utility, it will at least show the path to someone who, with more virtue, more discourse and judgment, will be able to fulfill this intention of mine, which, if it will not bring me praise, ought not to incur blame. Machiavellian mock humility says, I'm really not up to the task, so I'll let someone or some others who come after me to fulfill my intention. I won't be praised, but I ought not to incur blame. That last part is as much to say, I ought not, but I will, and which he did. At the very least, this passage suggests that he is concerned with managing his own praise and blame, just as he advises princes to in Prince chapter 15. He's concerned with fulfilling his intention and, as we now espy, with getting others to carry on for him. It's part 3, grand intention and tough guy talking. Machiavelli writes in another passage of handing over to others whatever it is he does intend. There, we not only find confirmation that he may be in earnest about getting others to fulfill his intention, but we also begin to see just what that intention is, at least negatively. And truly, if the virtue that then in antiquity used to reign and the vice that now reigns were not clearer than the sun, I would not go on. Let me make sure I'm in the right. Yes, I am in the right screen. I would go on speaking with more restraint. But since the thing is so manifest that everyone sees it, I will be spirited in saying manifestly that which I may understand of the former and of the latter times, so that the spirits of youths who may read these writings of mine can flee the latter and prepare themselves to imitate the former in whatever time fortune may give them opportunity for it. So he now identifies an audience, one that might help to overcome somewhat the problem of enemies who benefit from the old orders and the weakness of the lukewarm defenders. That audience is the young. They're not yet as deeply invested in the old order, and far from lukewarm, they're generally red hot to improve their situations, at least compared to us old timers. Not only that, the young just keep coming, generation after generation. And there his writings will be to greet them, until it happens that the teaching takes hold and can be put into practice, perhaps a bit at a time, perhaps all at once. And he, in fact, leaves instructions for both methods in successive passage of the Discourses, that is, doing it fast or doing it slow. But more to the point, he's identified the problem he has devoted himself to solving in both of his comprehensive books, the books in which he conveys everything he knows. The problem is the wretched condition into which the Western world has collapsed in his time, as compared at least to the vibrant strength of the ancient world. He says, I believe it arises from the cause that makes the weakness of the present generation and the corruption. I believe it arises from the same cause that makes men less strong now, which I believe is the difference between our education and the ancient, founded on the difference between our religion and the ancient. We're talking about the contempt of human things, of Christian religion. He says, and if our religion asks that you have strength in yourself, it wishes you to be capable more of suffering than of doing something strong. This mode of life thus seems to have rendered the world weak and given it in prey to criminal men, who can manage it securely, seeing that the collectivity of men, so as to go to paradise, think more of enduring their beatings than of avenging them. One may, if one wishes, see the passage as nothing more than an expression of revulsion at the criminal exploitation of believers by hypocritical priests. If one stopped there, however, one might say the real problem is the prelate's hypocrisy, and the real solution is to restore the spiritual and moral integrity of the church, something that, say, Martin Luther intended to do at the same time. But Machiavelli's concern is different and arguably deeper. The real problem, according to him, is the lack of any need for virtue in order to maintain the exploitation perpetrated by the prelates, as he sees it. As Machiavelli says in chapter 11 of The Prince, this is where he's talking about ecclesiastical principalities like the papacy. These priests keep their states however they proceed. They have subjects and do not govern them. The subjects, though ungoverned, do not care, and they neither think of becoming estranged from such princes, nor can they. How the priests manage this feat is a long story, but part of it is that, thanks to Rome's aggressive military expansionism and consequent destruction of political freedom and independence throughout the world, the church came into being in a post-political world. Another part of that story is that the teachings and the structure of the church successfully manage human passions, indeed, the passions of humanity as such, in a manner and on a scale that had not been attempted or perhaps even imagined by classical writers. Machiavelli's problem is how to return the world to something resembling ancient excellence without just setting up a return at some future date to the same kind of weakness. One element of the solution is to revive politics by reviving a concern with and an attachment to particular entities. Another is to do so using structures and teachings that learn from and parallel those by means of which Christianity had ruled the world for over a millennium. How to bring off this reverse imitation of Christianity? A key element is to distribute far and wide all sorts of tough guy advice on how to beat your enemies. Machiavelli delivers the lessons with singularly appealing panache, especially appealing to the ambitious, and his many wicked pieces of advice are what he is most widely remembered for. Much of this advice is understood by most to entail a specific claim about human nature. Machiavelli places such a great emphasis on the viciousness of human beings that it is tempting to take the fact of human evil to be the fulcrum of his thought. Because human beings are naturally bad, one must strive to be the best at being bad or risk ruin at the hands of those who are worse than you. He seems to talk as though human beings simply are a certain way, with the implication, never stated but frequently traded on, that human nature is fixed in a particular way. By nature, human beings have been, are, and will remain insecure, selfish, envious, greedy, and aggressive. Yet this kind of assessment and related advice have always been around. There have always been tough guys, and some have generally been willing to go into the consulting business. So dispensing hard-boiled advice could hardly break the grip that the church and its teaching have on the people and on the world. But they can always play the trump card by saying, see, we told you, the world is fallen and evil. So all the more reason you need to rely on us for salvation. If human evil is really the basis of Machiavelli's thought, it is neither unique nor especially helpful in restoring human virtue or excellence. Furthermore, a moment's reflection yields the recognition that he acknowledges the fact of human goodness as well. He discusses many individuals and peoples whom he considers good in the usual moral senses of kind, giving, grateful, and just. The real question is what to do in the face of these human facts. The really important thing about human nature for Machiavelli is that it's neither fundamentally good nor fundamentally evil. Rather, the crucial fact regarding human nature for Machiavelli is, I believe, that it is quite malleable. Not infinitely so, but considerably so. Insight into this malleability, greater than and perhaps different in kind from that acknowledged by classical political philosophy, promises expansionism of another kind, different from the military expansionism of his Romans. Machiavelli's is the expansion of what is possible for humanity. The claim that human nature is malleable would seem to be belied by numerous prominent Machiavellian assertions. Among the most telling is the one in passage 10 here. It is necessary to whoever disposes a republic and orders laws in it to presuppose that all men are bad, and that they always have to use the malignity of their spirit whenever they have a free opportunity for it. He seems here to contend that all humans are bad by nature, to offer as evidence the fact that they spew forth their malignant spirits at the first opportunity, and to advise making laws to counter that malignity. Yet even if one ignores the immediate context, which we'll consider in a minute, the passage clearly does not support such a reading. For Machiavelli here actually asserts exactly nothing about human beings, let alone about human nature. Rather, he makes a claim about what must be assumed about human beings, implicitly distinguishing between assumptions one does well to adopt and a condition that actually always already obtains. In addition, the claim is not about what everyone must assume, just about what founders and legislators must assume. And not all founders and legislators, only Republican ones. Nor does he speak here or anywhere in his comprehensive works of human nature in the abstract, but of all men or the generality of men. He talks about the nature, he uses the word nature, but he never says human nature. Finally, to say that such founders and legislators must operate on the basis of a particular assumption in no way entails or even implies a claim about whether the assumption is simply true, let alone true without any qualifications. Therefore, the most that can be claimed on the basis of this passage is that Machiavelli advises Republican rulers to be skeptical regarding human goodness in political life. Indeed, far from breaking from the ancients with this advice, Machiavelli seeks to emphasize his continuity with the tradition. The entire passage is prefaced by, as those demonstrate who reason on a civil way of life, and as every history is full of examples, it is necessary, and so on. Those who reason on civil life are the classical political philosophers, and every history includes, for Machiavelli, the Bible. He thereby signals his agreement with the tradition as such about how especially founders must orient themselves towards certain givens in human beings. He begins to prepare his departure from them, however, by taking to the limit the moral skepticism contained in the advice that Republican founders assume men are bad. Apparently no longer elaborating on what Republican founders and legislators must assume, he continues, when any malignity remains hidden for a time, this proceeds from a hidden cause, which is not recognized because no contrary experience has been seen, indicating that even when it seems that men are good, and no matter how long this appearance lasts, one must, to use the word earlier in the passage, presuppose that malignity is hidden somewhere and that it is hidden by a hidden cause. He seeks to cultivate a hermeneutics, methodology, or attitude of suspicion. Machiavelli again begins to appear not just as a theorist of conspiracies, which he spends a lot of time on, but as founder of conspiracy theory, as a fundamental orientation to the moral and political world. The emphasis in the wider context is not only on the badness of human beings, but on the efficacy of the customs, laws, and especially institutions to shape humans. This emphasis is most pronounced in the section of the discourses devoted to the character of the multitude. There, Machiavelli explicitly announces his fundamental disagreement with all previous authorities as to the constancy of the multitude. A people, he says, is seen to begin to hold a thing in horror and to stay in that horror and to stay in that opinion for many centuries. For Machiavelli, the people are, as Leo Strauss said, the repository of morality and can be relied on for centuries on end to hold fast to a given morality. Such moral constancy would seem to tell against my claim that human nature is malleable. This appearance holds, however, only if one fails to pause to consider the moment at which a people is seen to begin to hold a thing in horror. We have to remind ourselves that Machiavelli is especially interested in such beginnings, not just those in which governments are formed, but great foundings like those of Moses, when a people did indeed begin to hold a thing in horror or awe, and then held fast to that opinion for centuries. we must briefly descend into the particulars of just what makes such moments possible, such beginning moments when a new morality takes hold. There are many means to facilitate such moments. It's wrong for me to say new morality, where a new way of life, a new civilization is formed. The key to so there are many ways to facilitate such moments. The key to the surest, however, is to exploit to the full what Machiavelli calls the nature of the multitude. The multitude speaks boldly against its prince's decisions until, that is, each member is made to stare his or her own particular punishment in the face, at which point they no longer trust one another and run to obey the prince. Therefore, one need not heed what they say, according to Machiavelli, whether good or bad, about their disposition toward their prince, whether a tyrannical prince or a republic. When together, the people resist in speech. Isolated by fear, they obey indeed. Time after time, Machiavelli's princes operate on this principle of manipulation. Furthermore, Machiavelli indicates that there is almost no limit to what princes of a certain type are able to achieve politically. A human being of rare brain and authority can shape any matter into a form opposite of its accustomed form, whether that's from republic to principality or principality to republic. The people, when each is isolated by fear for himself, are putty, or better yet, clay in his hands. This extreme case reveals how very malleable human beings are. Though Machiavelli does not leave it at that, he elevates a version of this extreme case to the level of what can be called his truest truth, applicable to all people and times. It is more true than any other truth that if where there are men, there are no soldier, this arises through the defect of the prince and not through any other defect either of the sight or of nature. Machiavelli will accept no excuse from princes or republics, from princes of republics or of principalities if they fail to shape human beings in accordance with the most fundamental of necessities. But then why did Machiavelli encourage us to think the opposite? That there is a nature of human beings that is fixed and is bad. To ask this is to raise the question of his own relation to the human matter he found before him and the possibilities he saw for it. He sought to employ the principle revealed and used to such dazzling effect by Christianity that together human beings resist authority, including reason's authority. While isolated by fear for themselves, they submit. But he sought to replace the fear of God with the fear of human beings for one another. It would serve his purposes well then to promote the view that each of us is by nature out to get the others. And what better way to promote this view of human beings than to convince them that inveterate predation and imperial expansion in particular is a necessity? Then let the race begin. In an earlier quoted passage, Machiavelli repeats the saying that time reveals every truth. And he also says that Christianity has shown to us the truth and the true way. Christianity showed Machiavelli that and how human matter could be changed, for Machiavelli, changed by human beings. And Machiavelli blazed a new trail, discovered a new continent, and shaped a new world. Part 4. How tough talk leads to a new world. It should now seem at least plausible that Machiavelli's intention was to replace a world ruled through fear of a being beyond man, who takes all the glory of man for himself, to a world that uses the same passions of fear and glory and places them on a new, purely human foundation. Yet the third sense of Machiavelli's meaning remains to be explored. That is the meaning of Machiavelli, the name. A shortcut to this end, to think this through, is to perform a thought experiment. What would have changed in the character and effect of Machiavelli's teaching if he had conveyed it exclusively through poetry or drama, through characters and fictional narrations, or more simply, if he had just published all of his works anonymously? Would it not have been as much as to say, you can gain glory and safety by using immorality, but I want to hide because I'm ashamed and I feel unsafe? The teaching would cancel itself out because he would have promised the glory he sort of shrank away from, and the security he obviously lacked. It would not change or challenge the general climate of opinion that enveloped all social life. Indeed, it would have submitted to it and thereby validated. It would have been another version, albeit an inverted version, of the tribute that vice pays to virtue. It would breathe the air of the general climate of moral opinion, even as it spoke the words of an immoral teaching. It would therefore fail to pierce or puncture that general atmosphere or climate of opinion in which what we say and do must be justified in terms of moral oughts of Christianity and classical philosophy. But now think of his action as Machiavelli actually chose to perform it. He wrote a didactic book, two especially, but the prince most famously, that is beguiling, useful, intelligent, and in some ways even beautiful, but above all, wicked, and proudly admit authorship. That's what he actually did. What did actually happen? Two things. Machiavel became a word that meant wickedness of every kind, especially force and even more especially fraud. And two, his thoughts were taken up and transformed by others. Sometimes it's with attribution. As when Francis Bacon says in The Advancement of Learning, that we are much beholden to Machiavelli and others that write about what men do and not what they ought to do. And in his essay on goodness, that Nicholas Machiavel had the confidence to put in writing, almost in plain terms, that the Christian faith had given up good men in prey to those who are tyrannical and unjust. Others do so in voce, as when Christopher Marlowe brings Machiavelli to life in his Jew of Malta. And let them know that I am Machiavel. Though some speak openly against my books, yet will they read me and thereby attain to Peter's chair, meaning the papacy. And when they cast me off, are poisoned by my climbing followers. I count religion but a childish toy and hold there is no sin but ignorance. Still others offer a deep bow, holding or pretending to hold their noses all the while, such as John Adams, who credits Machiavelli with being the great restorer of true politics, reviving reason in matters of government, and having a great deal of wisdom, but he hastens to add, though it is unfortunately mixed with too much wickedness. More often than not, Machiavelli's name is passed over in prudent silence, while his teaching is dressed in more respectable clothing, as by Descartes in his project to make human beings the masters and possessors of nature, by Galileo in his rejection of imaginary final causes and embrace of effectual or efficient causes, by Hobbes in his portrayal of man's natural condition as one of war, by Smith and Mandeville in theories in which private vice leads to public benefit. The list goes on. Machiavelli intended his teachings to be taken up and carried on by others, and so they were. He could not know his successors' particular destinations, but he knew their general direction, forward. And he taught them well how to read the lay of the land wherever they found themselves. Part 5, Machiavelli as reader. I've tried to make plausible the idea that Machiavelli founded the moral, political, and even intellectual and spiritual world in which we live. If this is so, he understood much or all of this in advance, as it were, and he therefore understands us better in some essential respects than we may understand ourselves. So nowadays, when someone steps out onto the stage of the modern world and says, submit to me because God or nature entitles me to rule you, that person's greeted with jeers or titters, or more likely still with yawns. Other claimants to entitlement to rule would meet with similar fates. This is not to deny that strong men gain additional luster from reflections coming from the surface of Machiavelli's teaching. It is, however, to assert that principled justifications of any kind tend to be met with skepticism, outright disbelief, or acquiescence, but cynical acquiescence. To bring about this state of affairs, Machiavelli did numerous things, but two stand out. On the one hand, he cagily allowed us to think human beings generally, including himself, were essentially and inveterately wicked, when really he thought we could be shaped to be good by means of open speech about how to be wicked. On the other hand, he generously left us a clear paper trail, some of which we've just followed, of the crimes he committed in writing. In the process, and perhaps most importantly of all, he gave a great deal of guidance on how to read. I gave a hint of that above in my discussion of how Scipio read Xenophon's education of Cyrus, with the result that he imitated Cyrus's mercy and thereby ultimately induced his own men to mutiny against him. At the point we picked up that particular portion of the trail, Machiavelli acted as though the fault was Xenophon's for writing up an imaginary principality. Elsewhere, however, he indicates that the fault was Scipio's for being an insufficiently careful or insufficiently wakeful reader. Machiavelli's generosity in this regard, by telling us about failures and successes of reading, affords us a number of options for responding to his writings and their effects. So we can do a bunch of different things. One, we could partake of his project knowingly, rather than being its unwitting accomplices once we read him carefully in the manner I've been suggesting. Two, we could recognize better its problems and failures more clearly and seek to solve or correct them. Three, we could think ourselves out of theoretical problems we may have concluded were the dispensation of fate or of history or of natural science, rather than the workings of a knowing and knowable human mind, that is Machiavelli's. Or we could oppose him practically with new methods of our own or with methods we've learned from his own battle plans, if we understand them well. Whatever we end up doing with what we learn from and about him, he has opened to us the door of his study in more ways than one. That is, we're invited to see the way he came to understand us so well, which was by understanding perfectly the great thoughts and deeds of those who came before him. I'll conclude with two passages of such study. The first is from a famous letter to his friend Francesco Vittori. It was written not long after Machiavelli, was removed from government office and put into exile. It describes an average day in which he walks in the woods, reads poetry by streams, and spends most of the day in boisterous arguments with the neighborhood riffraff over cards. And yet, he goes on. When evening has come, I return to my house and go into my study. At the door, I take off my clothes of the day, covered with mud and mire, and I put on my regal and courtly garments. And decently reclothed, I enter the ancient courts of ancient men, where, received by them lovingly, I feed on the food that alone is mine and that I was born for. There I am not ashamed to speak with them and to ask them the reason for their actions, and they in their humanity reply to me. And for the space of 4 hours, I feel no boredom. I forget every pain. I do not fear poverty. Death does not frighten me. I deliver myself entirely to them. And because Dante says that to have understood without retaining does not make knowledge, I have noted what capital I have made from their conversation, and I have composed a little work. That little work is, of course, The Prince, in which he fills out his thought on reading. He says in its dedicatory letter, I have found nothing in my belongings that I care so much for or esteem so greatly as the knowledge of the actions of great men, learned by me from long experience with modern things and a continuous reading of ancient ones, having thought out and examined these things with great diligence for a long time. Machiavelli thereby sets the standard for any serious course of study, perhaps even more so in our times than in his own. For when we read truly excellent books, we study, most importantly, the permanent problems of human life and of existence as such, but also the actions of great human beings of the past, by which I mean both the historical and imagined actions depicted in great works, but also, and in some respects, even more importantly, the actions of the writers themselves. For every one of these thinkers made the fateful decision to write, which is always and essentially to act. I've tried to show that Machiavelli's was unique in the history of thought in that he attached his name to an immoral teaching as part of his overall enterprise to create or found the modern world, hostile to divine intervention, but friendly to human excellence of a particular kind. I'm going to stop here and see if we have questions and sort of turn it over for now to Kendall.
All righty, hang on a second here. I should be visible now. Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much. Before I turn to the first question, a poll should be appearing. That is a POLL. Poll should have just appeared on your screen. This is a new thing that we're doing, and so this is the first time for Jan and me to do this. This poll concerns a possible course on Machiavelli taught by today's speaker, Chris Lynch, for spring quarter. And as you answer that poll, I shall begin to read the questions. Oh wow, it comes in lifetime. This is democracy. Let's see here, Chris. The first question, and there are very many questions. I'm afraid, let's see, 111, we won't be able to get to them all, but if I will just get to business here, we'll be able to do most of them. Chris Chavez asks, would Trump or Lyndon B. Johnson qualify as Machiavellian?
Certainly not Machiavellian at the highest level that sort of I was aiming at. I'm getting an internet connection unstable. Are you hearing me okay, Kendall?
I hear you now. You fritzed a little bit, but
okay.
The intellectual quality came through.
Okay. So sure, they're Machiavellian, but at a pretty low level, right? Because and I'd say Trump's at a lower level than Johnson. Machiavellian because they know how to motivate people, and they use the lever that I mentioned very well. Both of them did, really getting people to have fear for themselves individually, and thereby sort of both isolating and then drawing people together under the banner of them. But this is a pretty low level. The level that Machiavelli is most interested in is people who do that with something really grand in mind. Now, when you compare LBJ to Trump, he did have something pretty big in mind. He really did. You could think of him as I don't know, a second, third, fourth refounder of the United States in some way with with the whole anti-discrimination regime that he set in motion, but still, this is not a fundamental reshaping of human life, and it's not refounding of a political entity in a fundamental way. It's working within that framework and changing it. But still, LBJ a lot closer than Trump, I'd say.
Thanks, Chris. Our second question comes from Alexandra Inzer, who asks, can virtue as discussed in The Prince be learned? If so, how did Moses learn it?
Yeah, great. I have no idea how Moses learned it. We're given so little of in the Bible of Moses, the youth. I mean, we get a little bit. Machiavelli does, he makes a lot of the fact that Moses and others like Moses were, exposed at birth, that their vulnerability of their very being to the world is, somehow sewn into them. But how he actually did, I don't know. But more generally, I think that that's what the Prince and the discourses on Livy are completely devoted to, helping you to learn, what it is you would need to do and especially the opinions that you have that you would need to jettison in order to behave like a Moses or like a Agathocles, a favorite example of a criminal that Machiavelli admires. It's an education that that has both elements of intellect and will in them. But that said, I think it's not as though he's actually, for the most part, wanting anyone in particular to do any of the particular horrible things that are talked about in the Prince and the Discourses and other works. But instead, it's to drive to the extreme ends of thought and morality, to think them all the way through, and to come out on the other side. Now, what that other side is, I think, for Machiavelli is philosophy and seeing things as they are, and then also taking action on the basis of philosophy and turning it into something that affects the whole world. But at least it's an exercise in reading Machiavelli, if you read him carefully, in facing your own opinions about the nature of things and of right and wrong, and then of taking a stance toward Machiavelli ultimately. Saying, I've adopted all sorts of assumptions I've gotten from Machiavelli. Do I embrace them or not? Am I going to reject them? If I'm going to reject them, on what basis? So he makes you go through an education if you read him carefully.
Thanks, Chris. The next question comes from Robert Riva, who asks, Boccaccio, La Mandragola always seemed to me that it could very much have been an extended story from the Decameron. Yet Mandragola seems very much in line with what you're describing in The Prince. Can you briefly distinguish Mandragola from Decameron? Your choice of tales not to be told among ladies, he says. Can you briefly distinguish these in terms of Machiavelli's claim to originality?
Okay, yeah, great question. The Mandragola is just the most famous of what are often called Machiavelli's literary works. Next quarter, I'm teaching a class where we'll read Prince and some passages from the Discourses, but we'll spend much of our time on the Mandragola, Boccaccio, another play of his, all sorts of poems, 30 poems that he's written in several stories, which are very much in the spirit of Boccaccio and the Mandragola. It's been said that Leo Strauss said this, or wrote this in a footnote in his book Thoughts on Machiavelli, that what Boccaccio did in the realm of love, Machiavelli did in the realm of politics. Now, that's the Machiavelli of the Prince and the Discourses and a few other works. But there is a Machiavelli who is basically like Boccaccio. And now one has to read Boccaccio, carefully to see, how very Machiavellian within the realm of love he is to really buy this. But there really are two Machiavellis, and it's very hard to know how to put them together, because one of them is very preoccupied with the private realm of love, the home and love, and not just preoccupied with, obsessed with, and in fact even characterizes himself when he's in that realm sometimes as oblivious to and looking down on, insofar as he thinks at all about politics. And then when he's on the side of politics, he thinks this realm of love doesn't matter. It's trivial, it's light, it's meaningless. He seems himself to go back and forth between them, and even talks about that. Writes to his friend Francesco Vittori about the fact that he and Vittori alternate back and forth between these two heterogeneous realms of existence or of their souls. So in a way, what you've asked by asking me to say, well, what about his originality? How's he different from Boccaccio? I guess there's in the realm of love, I don't think he's essentially different from Boccaccio. But then the question becomes, how does that comport with everything Machiavelli says on politics? In a way, both follow the same kind of rules of manipulation, but they are both completely different realms, and how they fit into the a whole or make up a whole, and how a life going back in between them, as Machiavelli's was, is a whole, or whether it's a whole, is a big question. But I think what you really see when you see Machiavelli doing that is Machiavelli the philosopher in the fullest sense, because he's moving between public and private and really hovering over the whole of things.
Thanks, Chris. The next question comes from Judith Wilkes, who asks, Machiavelli admires the Persian ruler Cyrus, and yet he says Scipio learned the wrong lessons from reading The Education of Cyrus. Could you clarify whether Cyrus was good or bad in Machiavelli's view?
Good question. Well put, too. Who is Cyrus? How do we have access to Cyrus? Mainly we have two books, and you can throw in the Bible too, because Cyrus the Great appears in the Bible regarding the Babylonian exile. How do we have access to him? We have access to him through books, right? Through writers. So Machiavelli puts forth Cyrus as good. So there is some sense in which Cyrus is someone to imitate. But there isn't just a Cyrus floating out there in space. It's who's Cyrus? Xenophon's Cyrus is one candidate. Then there are two different ways to read Xenophon, basically. I mean, there are countless ways, but two for our purposes. One, like Scipio read him. Machiavelli says suggests Scipio read him poorly. The other is to read him well, okay, and to see how very Machiavellian Xenophon's understanding of things is, and Cyrus is as a ruler. So reading him well is what Machiavelli teaches us by saying Cyrus is good, Scipio imitated him, that was bad. So now we're forced to think about both imitation and interpretation. Okay, and each has to be done well, but the first is interpretation. The answer has to be dual, and it really points to the need to read, and a reminder that we don't have access to these historical figures in themselves. It's mediated by authors, and the reading of them is the key.
Thank you, Chris. The next question comes from Anna Carrillo, who asks, for Machiavelli, is virtue merely procedural? Having the proper means to achieve the end. But how about the end? Does it include, for Machiavelli, an ethical universal?
Good. Yeah, I don't think it probably does include an ethical universal. X is what everyone ought to do, and in the absence of that, be in the wrong and or be unhappy. So no, I don't think it does. I think, though, that for Machiavelli, he deliberately does not explicitly address the end, and in fact says, that if you were to think of the end, the goal, the purpose of human life, as everyone before him did, which is in terms of a human happiness that is gained either by living in accordance with God's commands or by living in accordance with the natural order of things, wherein the natural order gives you a hierarchy of ways of understanding the world in your own soul, such that it needs to be ordered in the right way. Machiavelli says if you think of ends or goals, the goal of human life that way, you're going to come to ruin. But he doesn't say, how you should think of the end of human life. He sort of seems to assume that the end is to survive, to keep your status. And he does that, and really sort of makes you take the path that I took us through a quick version of, where you think through all that's necessary to do in order to maintain that status. And then insofar as you do that and sort of follow along, it's within the realm of practice. But I think what Machiavelli really thinks is the end is the activity that you engage in while you're doing that thinking through. Okay, that what he says, There's a great passage in the discourses, and he repeats it at a couple different points. But being a better knower of the world, and thereby not being taken away, and he's adapting an ancient quotation here, not being swept up by good fortune or downcast by bad fortune. And the thing that allows you to do that is to be a knower of the world. So he suggests, without putting it out there explicitly, that for him, the end of life, the end of human life, is the same as it is for Aristotle. That is, to know. That's the highest thing you can do. But Machiavelli won't talk in terms of highest. You could say that he can't. If he does, he goes right back into that ancient understanding of things, of imaginary republics and principalities. So instead, what he does is he makes you sort of forget about those big, high-flown questions, get into the business of trying to survive and overcome others and gain glory. And then willy-nilly recognize, as you climb up the ladder of doing that well, that it really involves you in knowing and being a knower. So he sort of makes knowing the end by making you need to do it. So necessity pushes you into knowing. So I say that for him, the goal is to be a knower.
Thank you, Chris. Now, this will be our final, well, it's going to be a lightning round. I'm going to combine three different questions. I'll read all three questions, but they overlap quite a bit. They are the next two, and then I'm going to skip one down. Part A by Nicholas Knorr, who asks, is Machiavelli recommending immorality, or is his counsel beyond good and evil? Part B, supplied by George Perez, who asks, can one apply Machiavelli in one's personal life and still remain moral and ethical? And then David Shiner asks, and I submit this as part C of the question, Machiavelli compliments Agathocles, but says he cannot be counted as great because of his cruelty. I'm not sure how that squares with your view of Machiavelli's amorality. Can you comment?
Okay, you're right. Those do all kind of come into the same orbit. I mean, Machiavelli, I think he's not Nietzsche, which the first question sort of asked, but my version of him gets pretty close, but it's not there all the way. Because he still acknowledges moral categories. He still is just willing to say what the ancients thought of as just is just, what they thought of as unjust is unjust. I'm not going to try and create a new table of values. But what he's saying is that if you adhere to that justice, at least as a beginning point, like I took us through, if you adhere to that justice, you're going to be in trouble. You're going to go down. Then that the question about Agathocles is very relevant to this, because Agathocles does what he needs to do to survive, and Machiavelli says it's in him cruelty and then blames it. But then as soon as he blames it and says that it can't be called virtue, he calls it virtue. And he says that because Agathocles' cruelty, he did not persist in it, and it was effective. He has, some. I can't remember the word, but it's as though it's like excuse or reparation in the eyes of God and of humanity. He basically first blames him, then removes all the bases for that blame. The most fundamental distinction that he introduces while talking about Agathocles is that between an excellent captain, which he says Agathocles was, and that between an excellent human being. And he says, well, he's not that. But then as the work goes on, he makes it clear that the distinction between excellent captain and excellent human being cannot be maintained. It just cannot be maintained. So he was really setting up a problem to solve by, both praising and blaming Agathocles. And the solution of it is to see in the text the two collapse, and then you have to think through. This is something I spent most of the time in the book that I just finished on war and Machiavelli's thought doing. You have to think through, what's the consequences for saying there's really no distinction between an excellent captain and an excellent human being. When you have the distinction, sure, you blame Agathocles. When you realize there's no distinction, you can't blame it.
All right, Chris, thank you very much. And that will do it for today. I'm going to try to honor our practice where give everyone a chance to express their, there you are. Everyone, you can unmute yourself and applaud our speaker. Thank you, Chris, for a very stimulating lecture. I only read questions out of the chats. There are very many compliments and hosannas and praises for you from the audience members. So thank you very much. And thank you, everybody, for coming. It was an outstanding turnout. And I hope you enjoy the sunshine for the rest of the, visually at any rate.
Be good, be good.
Farewell. See you in classes
Bye.
next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
He needs
Thank
a
you.
few more though. I put one over
Fantastic.
here.
Thank you, thank you, thank
Okay.
you.
Chair, really
Supplement and
enjoyed.
compliment.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
Great lecture.
Oh, thanks.
Great lecture. Thank you.
Thank you.
Righty. Very good.
I hope the class is offered.
Thank you.